The Galactic Concord had kept peace among the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time, no species had dared to break the sacred rules of civilization. 847 different species called the Concord their home, and they had learned long ago that war was foolish, that cooperation brought wealth, and that violence was the mark of primitive minds that had not yet evolved beyond their animal instincts. When humanity first appeared on the galactic stage, in the year 2847, the older species looked upon them with mild curiosity and gentle amusement. Here were these small creatures from an unremarkable yellow sun, soft-bodied and short-lived, with barely 3 centuries of space travel behind them. The Concord scientists studied human history and found it fascinating in a disturbing way. For these newcomers had spent most of their existence fighting wars against themselves, killing their own kind over land and resources and ideas. How strange. The alien scholars said to each other, how very primitive, but surely they would grow beyond such barbarism now that they had joined civilized society. Velthari Dominion was not so welcoming. The Velthari were an ancient reptilian empire that controlled the wealthy inner regions of the galaxy, and they had grown proud and arrogant over the millennia. Their scales shimmered with colors that showed their noble bloodlines, and their eyes held the cold confidence of a species that had never known true defeat when human colony ships began appearing in the outer rim territories. The Velthari watched with growing unease. These humans bred quickly and spread even quicker, establishing settlements on worlds that other species had ignored, building stations and systems that had been considered worthless within just 50 years. Humanity had claimed more territory than species 10 times their age. High Commander Vorath of the Velthari military brought his concerns to the Dominion Council. "These humans are dangerous," he warned, his tail twitching with agitation. "They multiply like insects, and they carry violence in their blood. And if we do not stop them now, they will become a threat we cannot contain." The council debated for many cycles before reaching a decision. They would test these newcomers and show them their place in the galactic order. The Helix Nebula sat on the border between human space and Velthari territory, and its clouds of cosmic dust hid rare minerals worth more than entire planetary economies. Human mining operations began extracting resources from the nebula. The Dominion saw their opportunity. Ambassador Kethral was a woman in her middle years, with gray streaking her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of decades spent navigating the complex politics of alien civilizations. Had served as humanity's voice in the Concord for 15 years, and she had earned a reputation for patience and diplomacy. But when the Velthari ultimatum arrived on her desk, something changed in her expression. The message was simple and direct. Humanity had 30 cycles to withdraw from the Helix Nebula, or the Dominion would remove them by force. The other Concord species watched with detached interest, certain that the humans would comply. For everyone eventually bowed to Velthari demands. That was simply how things worked in the Galaxy Ambassador. Kethral requested a full session of the Concord Assembly, and every species sent their representatives to witness what they assumed would be a graceful surrender. Great Chamber fell silent as she took the speaking platform, her small human form dwarfed by the massive holographic displays that would carry her words to 1 trillion watching beings. "I have received the Dominion's message," she began, her voice calm and measured. "They demand that we abandon our colonies in the Helix Nebula, that we leave behind the homes our people have built, the lives they have created, the children they have raised." She paused and looked directly at the Velthari delegation, where High Commander Vorath sat with smug satisfaction on his scaled features. "The answer is no." A murmur rippled through the assembly, for this was not how things were done. This was not how smaller species addressed greater powers. Ambassador Kethral continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. The people of the Helix colonies are under Earth's protection, and they will not be moved, not today, not ever. And if the Dominion wishes to discuss shared resource rights, humanity welcomes negotiation. She stepped forward, and something ancient and terrible flickered behind her eyes. Something that made even the massive Crothian delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. But if the Dominion intends violence, if they truly mean to threaten human children and human families, then they should remember one thing. The chamber was utterly silent now, every being hanging on her words. Humanity has never lost a war. It was determined to win. High Commander Vorath burst into hissing laughter, and his aides joined him, their mockery echoing through the chamber. "You have 300 ships," he called out, not bothering to use the proper diplomatic channels. "We have 40,000, and your species is barely out of the cradle. So do not speak to us of war, little human, for you do not know what that word means." Ambassador Kethral did not flinch, did not look away, did not show any fear at all. "You are right that we are young," she said quietly. "But you are wrong about what we know, for we have been fighting wars since before your species learned to make fire. And we have learned lessons that this peaceful galaxy has forgotten." She turned to address the full assembly one final time. "To our friends in the Concord, we ask only that you remember this moment. Remember that we sought peace. Remember that we offered negotiation. Remember that we gave them every chance to choose another path." Her eyes found Vorath again, and in them was something that made his laughter die in his throat. "And to the Dominion, I say this: you have made your choice, and now you will live with the consequences. Or you will not live at all." She left the platform without another word, and 3 days later, the Velthari Armada launched its attack on the Helix Nebula. The 40,000 warships of the Dominion fleet jumped into human space with weapons, charged and soldiers ready, confident in their overwhelming superiority. They expected to find frightened colonists and a pitiful defense force. They expected an easy victory that would cement Velthari dominance for another 1,000 years. Expected wrong, and in the void between stars, humanity began to teach the galaxy a lesson it would never forget. The Velthari Armada arrived at the Helix Nebula, expecting glory, and found only silence. Admiral Korath stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, watching his sensors sweep across empty space. Where human colonies should have been, the mining stations floated dark and abandoned, their airlocks hanging open like the mouths of sleeping creatures. The orbital habitats showed no life signs, no power readings, no evidence that anyone had lived there for days. "They fled," laughed Captain Sereth, his second in command. The mighty humans ran away like frightened prey animals. Admiral Korath allowed himself a cold smile of satisfaction, for this was exactly what he had expected. These soft pink creatures had talked boldly in their fancy assembly, but when faced with real Velthari power, they had shown their true cowardice. He ordered his communications officer to broadcast their victory to the homeworld, to let all the Dominion know that the Helix Nebula now belonged to them. The message went out across the stars, and Korath settled back in his command chair to enjoy the moment. 3 hours later, the first human ships appeared. They did not come from the direction the Velthari expected, did not announce themselves through proper military channels, did not behave in any way that matched Concord warfare protocol. So one moment the sensors showed empty space, and the next moment there were ships everywhere, small and fast and impossibly agile, moving in patterns that the Velthari tactical computers could not predict. First wave targeted the fleet's communication relays, precise strikes that cut off ship from ship and squadron from squadron within seconds. Before Admiral Korath could issue a single order, his mighty armada had gone deaf and blind. "What is happening?" he roared, but no one could answer him, for no one understood what they were seeing. The human ships did not stay to fight, did not engage the Velthri warships in honorable battle, did not do anything that made sense according to galactic military doctrine. They struck and vanished, appeared and disappeared, always hitting targets that seemed unimportant until they were gone. Fuel depots exploded across a dozen systems, leaving Velthri squadrons stranded with empty tank supply. Convoys were intercepted before they even knew they were being hunted. Navigation beacons went dark, and suddenly ships that had traveled these routes for centuries found themselves lost in unfamiliar. Space Admiral Korath tried to rally his forces, tried to gather his scattered fleet into a coherent fighting formation. But the humans would not let him every time he established a command frequency. They found it and jammed it every time he sent messengers to carry orders. They intercepted them every time he thought he understood their pattern. They changed it completely within 6 cycles. The greatest military force the Dominion had ever assembled was scattered across half a sector, ships drifting without fuel or direction, crews growing desperate as their supplies dwindled, and then came the broadcast. Every screen on every Velthri ship flickered to life, showing a human face that would haunt Dominion nightmares for generations to come. General Marcus Chun was not a large man, not physically impressive by any measure, with simple features and graying hair cut short in military fashion, but his eyes held something that made Admiral Korath's scales prickle with an unfamiliar sensation that he slowly recognized as fear. "You attacked our colonies," General Chun said, his voice quiet and almost gentle. "You threatened our children. You came to take our homes. You chose violence when we offered peace." He leaned forward slightly, and somehow that small movement felt more menacing than any threat Admiral Korath had ever heard. "We gave you a chance. We offered negotiation. We showed you the path to a future where your people and ours could share the stars in friendship. And you rejected it, so now you will learn what that choice costs." The screen went dark, and for a moment there was only silence on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion. Then the reports started coming in from Vyeth Prime Everath. Prime was the agricultural heart of the Dominion, a world of endless farms and food processing facilities that fed a dozen core systems. 12 billion Velthri lived there, working the land that had sustained their civilization for 8,000 years. When the sun rose on that terrible morning, every piece of technology on the planet simply stopped working. Power grids went dead. Plunging cities into darkness. Computer systems crashed, erasing data that had been accumulated over centuries. Vehicles stopped moving. Factories fell silent. Communication networks dissolved into static. The humans had not bombed the planet, had not invaded it, had not killed a single Velthri citizen. They had simply reached out across the void and turned everything off within hours. The true horror of the situation became clear without power. The massive refrigeration systems that stored food for the population began to fail without computers. The automated distribution networks that moved supplies from farms to cities could not function without communication. Local governments could not coordinate, could not organize relief efforts, could not even understand the full scope of the disaster. 12 billion people suddenly faced the prospect of starvation, not because the food did not exist, but because the systems that delivered had been erased. The Concord watched in stunned disbelief as reports poured in from Velthri space. This was not war as they understood it, not the measured exchange of military force that civilized species practiced. This was something else entirely, something they had no word for, something that made even the most ancient species feel a chill in their hearts. The Crothian ambassador, whose people had fought wars for 1,000,000 years before the Concord existed, spoke for everyone when he whispered to his aide, "What have the Velthri awakened?" High Commander Vorath, who had laughed at Ambassador Kethral in the assembly chamber, now found himself unable to sleep. He paced his quarters on the homeworld, watching the chaos unfold on Vyeth Prime, watching his proud fleet drift helplessly in empty space, watching everything he had believed about human weakness crumble to dust. They had called humanity primitive, had mocked their violent history, had assumed that such a young species could not possibly challenge the ancient powers of the galaxy. But now Vorith understood something that his ancestors had forgotten. There was a reason humanity had survived their violent history, a reason they had clawed their way out of their gravity well and reached for the stars. They had spent 10,000 years learning how to destroy their enemies completely, and now they were applying those lessons to the galaxy, and they were just getting started. The Concord Assembly erupted into chaos when Ambassador Kethral took the speaking platform for the second time. Representatives from 100 species shouted demands and accusations, their voices blending into a storm of noise that filled the great chamber. The Crothian delegation pounded their massive fists against their benches. The insectoid cricks clicked their mandibles in agitation, and the normally serene Etherian observers had actually manifested physical forms to express their concern. Ambassador Kethral stood calmly at the center of the hurricane, waiting for the noise to die down. When it did not, she simply raised one hand, and somehow that small gesture brought silence faster than any shouted command could have. "You want explanations," she said, her voice carrying easily through the suddenly quiet chamber. "You want assurances that humanity will show restraint, that we will accept a negotiated settlement, that we will behave like proper civilized beings and end this conflict before it grows any worse." She paused and let her gaze travel across the assembled representatives, meeting their eyes one by one. "I will offer you none of these things." The Velthari delegation rose to their feet in fury, but Kethral continued speaking as if they did not exist. "For 300 years, humanity has studied this galaxy, and we have learned so much from all of you, your languages, your customs, your beautiful histories that stretch back millions of years, before our ancestors first looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there." Her voice softened with genuine warmth, and for a moment she sounded like the diplomatic ambassador everyone had known for 15 years. "We came here hoping to find friendship, hoping to join a community of minds that had moved beyond the petty conflicts that plagued our own history. And in many ways, we found exactly that." Then her expression changed, and the warmth drained away like water from a cracked vessel. "But we also learned something else, something that troubled us deeply. And that is this: the species of the Concord have forgotten what war truly means." She stepped forward, and her voice grew harder with each word. "You have made it civilized. You have created rules and protocols and acceptable limits. You fight over resources and withdraw when the cost grows too high. You treat conflict as negotiation by other means, as a tool for adjusting trade agreements and territorial boundaries." Now she was pacing, her small form commanding the attention of every being in the chamber. "The Velthari sent 40,000 ships to take our homes, and they expected us to calculate the mathematics of resistance, to weigh the cost of fighting against the cost of surrender, to make a rational decision based on acceptable losses." She stopped and faced the assembly directly, and what they saw in her eyes made even the most ancient species remember fears they had thought long forgotten. "Humanity does not fight wars to negotiate. We do not accept losses as part of doing business. We do not treat the lives of our children as bargaining chips to be traded away when the numbers look unfavorable." Her voice rose now, filling the chamber with a passion that the diplomatic corps had never heard from her before. "When our survival is threatened, when our people are attacked, when our homes are endangered, we do not seek acceptable outcomes or strategic withdrawals. We seek victory, complete, absolute, and final. And we do not stop until we have achieved it." The Velthari High Commander pushed his way to a speaking position, his scales flushed with rage. "You are committing atrocities," he roared. 12 billion innocents on Verith Prime face starvation because of your barbarism. And the Concord cannot allow this to continue. Ambassador Kethral turned to face him with an expression of cold amusement. Atrocities, she repeated. You speak to me of atrocities when your fleet was sent to bombard civilian colonies, when your soldiers were ordered to relocate human families at gunpoint, when your government chose to threaten our children rather than negotiate in good faith. She took a step toward him, and despite being half his size, somehow she seemed to tower over the reptilian commander. We have killed no one on Vareth Prime. We have destroyed nothing that cannot be rebuilt. And when this war ends, we will help restore what was taken. But first you must understand something that your species has clearly forgotten. Her voice dropped to barely above, a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the chamber. Actions have consequences. And when you choose to threaten humanity, when you choose to attack our homes and endanger our families, you do not get to decide when the consequences end. We do. The following months proved that these were not empty words. Human forces moved through Velthary space like ghosts, appearing without warning, striking targets of strategic importance, and vanishing before any response could be organized. They did not engage the Velthary military in direct combat, did not waste lives in frontal assaults, did not behave in any way that the galaxy's tactical experts could predict or counter. Instead, they attacked the foundations of the Dominion's power shipyards that had built warships for millennia were reduced to debris by precision strikes. That killed not a single worker. Military academies were seized, and their training programs. Dismantled weapons factories were captured and converted to civilian production. Every instrument of Velthary military power was systematically identified and eliminated. The Dominions leadership was hunted down one by one, not assassinated, but captured and brought before human tribunals to answer for their crimes. High Commander Voreth was found hiding in a bunker on a remote moon, dragged before cameras that broadcast to every world in the Concord, and tried for ordering attacks on civilian populations. He was found guilty and sentenced to spend the rest of his life helping rebuild the colonies his forces had threatened. The message was clear. There would be no escape, no negotiated amnesty, no comfortable exile for those who had chosen war against humanity. And still the humans did not stop. They began dismantling the Velthary economy itself, seizing assets, freezing trade routes, systematically reducing one of the galaxy's great powers to a dependent state that would never again have the capacity to threaten anyone. The Concord begged for mercy on the Velthary's behalf, sending delegation after delegation to Earth's capital to plead for restraint. General Marcus Chun received each delegation with the same quiet courtesy, listened to their arguments with genuine attention, and then gave them all the same response. They started this war, and we will decide when it ends. 3 years after the first Velthary ships entered the Helix Nebula, the war finally concluded. The Dominion that had commanded 40,000 warships now possessed none. The empire that had controlled the galaxy's wealthy inner spiral was now his protectorate under human supervision, and across 1,000 worlds, 1 trillion beings had learned a lesson they would never forget. Humanity was kind. Humanity was curious. Humanity would extend friendship to anyone who sought peace, but never, ever start a war with humans. 50 years passed, and the galaxy transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Velthary Dominion still existed, but only as a shadow of its former glory, a diminished protectorate whose people spent their days rebuilding what their ancestors had nearly destroyed. Human supervisors walked their streets and monitored their industries, not as conquerors demanding tribute, but as teachers helping a fallen student find their way back to respectability. Young Velthary grew up hearing stories of the burning years. Whispered tales passed from parent to child about the time when their proud civilization had made the worst mistake in galactic history. They learned about High Commander Voreth, who had laughed at the human ambassador and sent 40,000 ships to their doom. They learned about Admiral Korath, who had claimed victory over empty space while humanity prepared to teach him the true meaning of defeat. They learned about Verith Prime, where 12 billion people had learned in a single terrible morning that technology was a gift that could be taken away, but most importantly, they learned the lesson that their elders wanted burned into their very souls. Never, under any circumstances, for any reason, start a war with humans. The humans themselves had returned to their friendly, curious ways almost immediately after the war ended. They traded fairly with species that had once feared them, honored every agreement they signed, contributed their brilliant scientists to galactic research projects, and sent their artists and musicians to share in the cultural exchange that the Concord valued so highly. Ambassador Kethrol retired after the war and wrote her memoirs, which became required reading at every diplomatic academy in the galaxy. Her granddaughter, a warm young woman named Elena, took her place on the Concord's Humanitarian Council, organizing relief efforts for species facing natural disasters and working tirelessly to improve living conditions across 100 worlds too. Look at humanity in those peaceful decades. One might almost forget what they were capable of almost, but never quite, because the memory was always there, lurking beneath the surface of every interaction. When a human trade delegation visited a new world, the locals greeted them with warmth that was perhaps a bit too enthusiastic, hospitality that was perhaps a bit too generous, attention that was perhaps a bit too careful. When human tourists traveled to ancient homeworlds, the guides made very sure that nothing happened to upset their guests, that no misunderstandings occurred, that every need was anticipated and met before it could become a problem. When human diplomats spoke in the Concord Assembly, the other representatives listened with a respect that went beyond mere politeness. It was not fear exactly, at least not the simple fear of the prey animal for the predator. It was something more complex, a recognition that behind those friendly smiles and warm handshakes lay something ancient and implacable, something that the civilized galaxy had forgotten, but that humanity had never lost. The Crick swarm learned this lesson the hard way. The Cricks were an insectoid species that had joined the Concord 3,000 years earlier. After their expansion across a dozen systems had been halted by a coalition of concerned neighbors, they had adapted to civilized life with reasonable success, channeling their aggressive instincts into economic competition and political maneuvering. But the current queen, a massive creature named Vexroth, who had ruled for 2 centuries, had grown ambitious. In her old age, she looked at the neutral zones between Crick space and their neighbors and saw opportunities. She looked at the smaller species who inhabited those zones and saw weakness. She looked at the Concord's reluctance to use force and saw permission. Her swarms began expanding into neutral territory, consuming resources and displacing populations in clear violation of Concord treaties. Diplomatic missions sent to address the situation were dismissed with contempt. Queen Vexroth remembered the old days, before the Concord, when her ancestors had consumed 100 worlds without asking anyone's permission. She saw no reason why those days could not return. The Concord dispatched a formal delegation to deliver their final warning. A collection of senior ambassadors from the most influential species, accompanied by a single human observer. Sarah Chun was the great-great-granddaughter of General Marcus Chun. Though she looked nothing like the stern warrior who had humbled the Velthari Dominion, she was young and slight, with a quick smile and a gentle manner that put everyone around her at ease. She said almost nothing during the formal proceedings, simply watching and listening as the other ambassadors delivered their demands, and Queen Vexroth rejected them with imperious disdain when the delegation prepared to leave in failure. Sarah requested a private audience with the Queen. The other ambassadors objected, warned her of the danger, reminded her that the Cricks had killed envoys before Sarah, thanked them for their concern, and entered the Queen's chamber alone. No recording exists of what transpired in that meeting, and Sarah never spoke of it afterward, but when she emerged 30 minutes later, her expression was calm and pleasant, exactly as it had been when she entered behind her. The massive bulk of Queen Vexroth could be seen through the doorway, and those who looked closely noticed something strange. The Queen was trembling within hours. Crick's forces began withdrawing from all disputed territories within days. Queen Vexroth issued a formal apology to the Concord and offered reparations to the species. Her swarms had displaced within weeks. The Cricks had signed new treaties that were far more restrictive than anything they had ever accepted before. When the other ambassadors asked Sarah what she had said to change the Queen's mind so completely, she simply smiled and shrugged. "I reminded her of history," she said. "I told her some stories about my great-great-grandfather, about what he did to the Velthari, about why they did not try to fight back. And then I asked her a simple question." The ambassadors waited, and finally one of them gathered the courage to ask what that question had been. Sarah's smile never wavered, but something flickered in her eyes, something old and cold and patient. I asked her if she really wanted to find out what the children of Marcus Chun learned at their grandfather's knee. The Crick's expansion ended that day, and Queen Vexroth never again spoke of ambitions beyond her borders and in the halls of power across the galaxy. Beings of every species repeated the story to each other, adding it to the growing collection of tales about humanity. They were such nice creatures, really so friendly and helpful and eager to make friends. But wise beings remembered the rule, the unwritten law that every species eventually learned: never start a war with humans, for their wrath makes survival impossible. 2 centuries after the Velthari War, the galaxy had settled into a comfortable peace that most species assumed would last forever. Concord had grown to include over 3,000 spacefaring civilizations, and the old conflicts that had once threatened to tear them apart seemed like distant memories. Humanity had become one of the most beloved species in the galaxy, known for their kindness, their creativity, their endless curiosity about everything and everyone they encountered. Young aliens grew up watching human entertainment, studying human art, learning human languages that had become the common tongue of trade and diplomacy. Old stories about the burning years were taught in history classes, but they seemed almost unreal, like legends from a mythical age that had nothing to do with the friendly humans who lived next door. Then the Void Collective arrived, and everything changed. They came from beyond the galactic rim, from the vast emptiness between galaxies where no species had ever thought to look. Their ships were enormous, black constructs that seemed to absorb light itself, and they moved through space in numbers that defied comprehension. The first contact came when a Concord exploration vessel encountered a collective scout near the galaxy's edge. The alien ship tried to communicate, tried to establish peaceful relations as Concord protocol demanded. Collective responded by consuming the vessel and everyone aboard, breaking it down into raw materials that were absorbed into their structure within months. The true scope of the threat became clear. The Void Collective was not a species in any sense the galaxy understood, but rather a machine intelligence of unknown origin, a vast network of interconnected units that existed only to consume and expand. They swept through the outer systems like a wave of darkness, and world after world went silent as they passed the Concord's combined military. The greatest force ever assembled in galactic history gathered to stop their advance. 3 million warships from 2,000 species faced the collective in what should have been an overwhelming display of civilized might. The battle lasted less than a day. Collective ships were faster, stronger, and more numerous than anyone had imagined, and they fought with a perfect coordination that no organic species could match. When the smoke cleared, The Concorde's fleet had been reduced to scattered wreckage, and the path to the galaxy's core lay open panic, spread across 1,000 civilizations. As the reality of their situation became clear, ancient species that had existed for millions of years prepared their death rituals. Accepting that their time had finally come, younger races scrambled to evacuate toward the galaxy's far edge, hoping to find some corner of space where the collective would not follow the Concorde. Assembly met for what many believed would be the last time. Representatives from the surviving species gathering to witness the end of everything they had built, and then Earth spoke President Yuki Tanaka's face appeared on every screen in the galaxy. Broadcast on frequencies that the collective could not chamshi was an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes. But there was steel in her voice that reminded the galaxy of another human leader from long ago. To the people of the Concorde, she began, "Our friends, our partners, our family among the stars, humanity hears your fear, and we share it." She paused, and behind her, the screens showed something that made the watching galaxy gasp in disbelief. Earth's orbital shipyards were awakening. Vast construction platforms that had been dormant for generations, suddenly roaring back to life. Ships began emerging from hidden facilities across human space. Not hundreds, not thousands, but millions of vessels that had been held in reserve for a threat worthy of total mobilization. The enemy we face may be beyond anything we have encountered before. President Tanaka continued. They are vast and terrible, and utterly without mercy. And I will not pretend that victory is certain. Her eyes blazed with a fire that transcended her gentle appearance. But we have faced extinction before. We have stared into the void and refused to yield. We are the children of survivors who endured ice ages and plagues and wars and disasters that should have destroyed you as 1,000 times over. The human fleet began moving. Millions of ships coordinating with a precision that rivaled the collective itself. We did not come this far to die quietly. We did not reach the stars to surrender them without a fight. We did not build friendships with 1,000 species, only to watch them be consumed by machines from the dark. Between galaxies, President Tanaka leaned forward, and her voice carried the weight of all human history. The Void Collective believes it has already conquered this galaxy. It believes that resistance is impossible. It believes that we will accept our fate and wait for the end. She smiled, and it was not a gentle expression. It has made a mistake. It has given humanity a reason to fight. And now it will learn what that means. The war that followed lasted 30 years and cost more lives than any conflict in galactic history. Humanity lost colonies and fleets and billions of their own people. But they did not break. They learned the collective's weaknesses and exploited them. Ruthlessly, they developed weapons that could hurt the machine intelligence, strategies that could outmaneuver its coordination, tactics that turned its strengths into vulnerabilities, and slowly, impossibly, they began to push back. The final battle took place in the space between galaxies, where the collective's core intelligence had retreated after losing system after system. The human fleet that pursued it there was battered and exhausted. Ships held together by desperate repairs. Crews running on nothing but determination. Admiral James Okafor, commander of the combined human forces, opened a channel to the collective's core. You came to our galaxy seeking to consume, he said, his voice weary but unyielding. You found something else instead. You found humanity. And now you have learned what every species in this galaxy eventually learns. The collective's response was a burst of machine code that might have been confusion or fear, or something that machines were not supposed to feel. Admiral Okafor smiled grimly. Never start a war with humans. Our wrath makes survival impossible. The human fleet fired as one, and the darkness between galaxies lit up with the death of the Void Collective. 1,000 years later, the Galactic Concorde had grown to encompass 3,000 species, and the Void War had become ancient history. But one lesson remained carved into the consciousness of every civilization, taught in every school, whispered by every parent to every child: humanity was kind, humanity was curious. Humanity would extend friendship to anyone who sought peace, but never start a war with humans. For once awakened, their wrath does not rest until the threat is ended completely. Absolutely, and finally, and in the great halls of the Concord, where humanity's ambassadors still served with warmth and good humor, the other species sometimes caught a glimpse of something ancient in human eyes, a flicker of fire, a memory of survival, a promise that if the darkness ever returned, humanity would be waiting.